Hello again, fellow listener. I hope you're doing well and staying safe in your home with your loved ones close to you. We are at episode 24 and the second one during this quarantine series. If you've just stumbled upon this episode, I'll have you know that this is part 2 of a previous episode 23 with Dr. Patrick Wilson. And if you still haven't heard episode 23, I'll advise you to listen to it before getting into this one. If you have already listened to the previous episode, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Fuel the Pedal. Welcome back, everyone. This is Gabriel Martins speaking to you during these tough times and hoping, as always, to provide you with some productive ways to use your time while listening to podcasts such as this one and learn more about nutrition-related topics for health and exercise performance. Having said that, I will add on that given the current situation that is affecting everyone, some particular topics may inevitably trend towards the coronavirus context, as it will be the case of future episodes, but I'll always try to focus on interviews and topics that can be somehow useful for us during and after we overcome this situation, as I'm sure we will. Today, on part 2 of this episode with Dr. Patrick Wilson, we're going to be talking about the practical aspects regarding the pre-race meal composition, the in-race nutrition, the FODMAPs diet, and how some supplements can positively or negatively affect the gut. For now, let's not waste any more time and resume our interview with Dr. Patrick Wilson, the athlete's gut, the inside science of digestion, nutrition, and stomach distress, part 2, up next on Fuel the Pedal podcast. Patrick, so one of the moments that appears to be critical to consider in all this discussion is the pre-race meal. And we want to provide enough fuel for the athlete to perform at his best, and we often stick to recommendations such as 1 to 4 grams per kilo of carbohydrates in the first 1 to 4 hours before the event, which may be very individual, but on the other hand, we want to do this with minimal or no GI discomfort at all, which is of course not always easy due to the amount of food we are considering here. And I'll frame this question with a practical example when I'm designing nutrition plans for cyclists, which I believe might be different from many other endurance sports. And why do I say this? Because in some situations, after breakfast, you could have a pre-snack before the race starts. Not only that, but the ingestion of food itself during the race might be more concentrated in the first 1 to 2 hours during the flats, because there might be less opportunity ahead during the mountains, particularly for those who are planning on attacking or defending their GC position, or because of other tactical aspects to consider. So, taking this particular scenario into consideration, Patrick, what foods should be avoided or could be more prone to cause a GI distress in this case of cyclists needing to concentrate their ingestion in the first hours of the race?
Yeah, I really like your example there that you gave in terms of you might be competing in a situation where you can ingest a lot early on, and then later on in the race, maybe because of the tactical things you have to consider or the demands in terms of elevation climb is going to maybe modify what you need to do before a race. There's general guidelines that you get from most organizations like the ACSM, the American College of Sports Medicine. As you mentioned, we'll kind of say in the 1 to 4 hour period before a competition, try to consume 1 to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body mass. So if it's 4 hours beforehand, you would target 4 grams per kilogram of body mass. If it was 2 hours beforehand, you would target 2 grams per kilogram of body mass. Now, what I'll say about those recommendations, when I've tried to dive into the literature, they're mostly theoretical in terms of the amounts. And then what you see is other recommendations like avoidance of fat, fiber, protein to a degree, and those are also largely theoretical. Which I mean by that is we really don't have a lot of research documenting that if you eat a mixed macronutrient meal that has moderate quantities of fiber, protein, and fat, that it really causes major issues for people. Now, my thought is that, yes, if you ate lots of fat, fiber, and solid protein foods 1 to 2 hours before a race, that's probably not going to be a great choice. Those substances or foods tend to slow emptying from the stomach. And that's generally not what you want right before the onset of intense exercise. So their recommendations are generally to focus on higher carbohydrate foods while limiting the amount of fat, fiber, and protein because of their effects on gastric emptying. But it's worth pointing out that there aren't really studies clearly showing differences in gastrointestinal function or distress when you avoid those substances versus when you include modest amounts in the pre-exercise meal. So it probably does come down to somewhat your own experience. I do have some concern about completely avoiding fat, fiber, and protein, especially if you're eating 4 hours or 3 hours before competition. You may be quite hungry by the time competition starts if you were eating basically just carbohydrates with absolutely no fat, fiber, or protein, especially when you get into that 3 to 4 hour period before competition. So I think it does come down to some extent trial and error. You definitely want to focus on carbohydrate intake because for a high-level athlete, that's primarily what you're probably going to be burning. There's not a great reason to consume lots of fat anyways because most of the fat that you consume in that meal is not going to be used for fuel during exercise because of the way that it's absorbed and metabolized. So logically, yes, it makes sense to focus on easily digested carbohydrates while paying attention to the amount of fat, fiber, and protein that you're consuming. As a rule of thumb, I would say, keep it to less than 10 grams each of those macronutrients, fat, fiber, and protein. Some cases it may need to be less the closer you get to exercise. Those are some, I guess, just practical rules of thumb based on my own thoughts and experience, but they're definitely not coming from studies that clearly show you have to be below 10 grams of each of those to avoid GI distress. It's somewhat surprising how little research there is on pre-exercise meal intake and its effect on gastrointestinal symptoms. There's quite a bit on how it affects substrate use, fuel use, and performance to a degree, but very little actually when you look at gastrointestinal function and gastrointestinal symptoms.
Well, that's kind of the idea I had too, hence my question. So this seems to be one of those situations where there's not much research to go on for us to base our actions, and you inevitably need to stick with the experience to guide you. I guess it's not a topic of interest study in the scientific community, but perhaps it should, considering how conditioning it is to performance during races, and perhaps even being that one meal most conditioning to performance, I would say. But still on this topic, Patrick, do you think that this lack of research on the pre-race meal made athletes somehow more susceptible to being influenced by social media in what they should eat? The reason for me to be asking this is because in cycling, we went from eating pasta for breakfast, being the only thing you could eat, to this moment now where it's eggs and oatmeal/porridge for everyone. And there's nothing wrong with it. Don't get me wrong. Perhaps I'm being too pushy with this argument since it's not the first time I talk about this in the podcast using this example. But my point is, there's nothing wrong with eating eggs and oats. But I just feel that athletes and people in general are being influenced by what everyone else is doing rather than sticking to their preferences. What are your thoughts on this, Patrick?
Yeah. I mean, humans are definitely social creatures, and especially with the advent of social media, it's easy to see what other athletes are doing because we're posting, pictures of things that we're eating or consuming or using. And part of, I think, the issue is, again, that there's such a lack of research to say one way or another what's going to be best in that pre-exercise period, that there's a lot of void that can be filled with stuff that either is just coming from anecdote or from other sources of information, which sometimes are questionable. But it's true. I mean, there just isn't a lot of research there, so athletes probably don't have as much to go on in terms of specifically choosing individual foods. Okay, so, you think of all the hundreds of different foods an athlete could choose to eat before a race, and we obviously aren't going to have studies that look at all those individual hundreds of foods. So I think probably forever we're going to have some just trial and error approach in terms of how athletes decide to fuel before training or competition, in part because it's not realistic to expect that we're going to have studies to answer every single question for every single food. And honestly, there's a lot of variation in the response to people with their GI symptom in eating. So even if you see in a study that on average one group does better with this food or meal versus another, that doesn't necessarily tell you about the individual responses. So it's, again, something that athletes don't necessarily always like hearing, but it is probably going to come down to some extent trial and error. Now, when I say trial and error, I mean be rigorous about it. You can eat a certain meal before a training session, document the time beforehand, and then track your symptoms during the training. And then you can switch to something else and see if there's any difference and repeat that over time. So I'm not just saying try a food and then don't really measure anything. I'm saying try a food or meal and actually document what's going on, and that's going to make it more likely you'll be able to identify a trigger if one of those foods is actually causing you a problem. But yeah, it's tough. It's tough to come up with practical recommendations, and that's why a lot of the recommendations stay fairly vague. They say this is the amount of general carbohydrate you should aim for. Try and limit the amounts of fat, fiber, and protein without getting into really specifics in terms of individual foods, because it comes down to the athlete's preferences, their routine, their beliefs about things. So it's a tough thing to make widespread recommendations that are going to apply to everybody well.
Yes, no doubt about it. It's something that needs to be practiced, and you need to be rigorous about it, just as you said, until you find what works best for you and not just copying what other athletes or some random person posted on Instagram. So another specific food that we could talk about here, Patrick, is coffee. And coffee is a sacred drink for cyclists, but in some cases it has some bad connotations, and in some athletes appears to be a possible trigger for reflux, as sometimes reported, or even in increasing bowel movements, while other people like myself feel no discomfort whatsoever with coffee. And sometimes the perception of the athlete is associated with caffeine and not with coffee itself. So for these athletes who seek to just obtain the benefits of caffeine ingestion, does the ingestion of caffeine in a capsule form eliminate this risk of GI distress?
Hard to say, because there's not a whole lot of research looking at caffeine coming from a pill versus coffee, and looking at GI function and symptoms, particularly in athletes. What I'll say is my guess is, this is an educated guess, that I don't think there's going to be necessarily a huge difference between caffeine coming from a pill versus caffeine coming from coffee. Part of the reason why I say that is there was a recent study published just this year in the European Journal of Nutrition that looked at the side effects of caffeine pill ingestion over the course of 3 weeks. So basically these people volunteered for a study where for 3 weeks they consumed a caffeine pill, I think it was 200 milligrams a day, and then another 3 weeks of placebo ingestion. And one of the things they asked these people about was gastrointestinal distress. Now, unfortunately, they didn't really specify individual symptoms. They just kind of looked at GI distress as a general category. And over the course of the 3 weeks when they had the caffeine ingestion, it seemed that they were more often reporting gastrointestinal distress during that 3-week period where they were consuming the caffeine versus the placebo. So given what we know about caffeine's other effects on the GI symptom, you mentioned increasing colon motility. There's studies to document that happens. Also, if you're someone who's anxious, or you're fasting, or you're already having kind of a higher level of adrenaline or catecholamines in your blood than average, throwing caffeine on top of that probably isn't going to be the best choice, because ingestion of especially larger doses of caffeine can cause additional secretion of those catecholamines. So for example, like if you're someone who deals with nausea during exercise or during training, and you don't like to eat before your training, it's probably not a great idea to ingest a bunch of caffeine in that situation, because it's more likely to provoke feelings of nausea in comparison to a situation where maybe you weren't fasted in an equally similar situation. So it's one where I would say don't avoid it necessarily, because there's so much research saying that caffeine could be beneficial for physical performance, endurance performance. But if you're one of those people that seems to struggle with maybe anxiety-related competition, GI distress, then I would maybe at least take a careful look at the dosage you're using, potentially back off some, because the studies that are done on caffeine and performance are using people in a lab in a non-real-life competition environment. And if you try and translate that to the real world, where people are probably more stressed and more anxious about their competition. I sometimes worry about the translation of the caffeine research for some individuals who are kind of your, anxious, wired athletes who probably don't need an extra stimulant in those environments or those situations.
Some really important points there, and the more reason to get the basics right and find out the foods that work for you on the pre-race meal so that you can take advantage of caffeine as an ergogenic aid in cycling. And after nailing the pre-race meal, we can go on and think about all the range of foods we can consume during the race. And this is perhaps where teams and even the food market got more innovative in the last decade, with rice cakes with different fillings on them, bars that have these labels with more natural ingredients packed with protein and nuts, which in some cases might be even problematic due to their high fiber and fat content, as we've been discussing here so far. And then there's the usual paninis with ham, bananas, carbohydrate drinks, sports bars, gels, and other new foods as well. And we could do a whole podcast episode around these foods and the many variations of sports drinks, the ratio of glucose, fructose, the concentration of the carbohydrate in the drinks, the gels, osmolality, and I think it's wiser to ask you, Patrick, your general overview on the most important things to consider when choosing the right foods to consume during cycling in long stages.
Yeah, it gets tough to generalize about specific foods and beverages in terms of which are most gut-provoking, in large part because there's just so much variation between people and how they respond. Some people seem to have iron stomachs where you can put almost anything into their gut and they're fine. And then others, the minute you change the concentration of carbohydrate or the composition, they start to have problems. But there are, I think, some general points I can probably make in terms of a starting point for athletes, and then based on their own experience, they can adjust from their experiences. One of the things you look at is kind of the food matrix, so bar ingestion versus gel versus fluid. And there have been at least a couple of studies that have directly compared bar ingestion to either a gel form or a fluid-containing carbohydrate source. And you generally see ratings of fullness and nausea being higher in the conditions where they get the carbohydrate from the bar. Now, why is that? Potentially it's because they usually standardize the delivery of these things based on the amount of carbohydrate. So let's say you want to feed people 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. If you're using a bar, remember that most bars also contain protein and fat. So if you're standardizing for the amount of carbohydrates between the conditions, the bar condition sometimes ends up providing more total energy because it has some additional fat and protein in it, and you're trying to equate the amount of carbohydrate. So that's one potential reason is just in these studies, they ended up getting more total energy to get the same amount of carbohydrates, and that can provoke symptoms. Or it's because the food matrix is actually just different. So gels and liquids are more kind of pre-digested, I guess is a word I would use. The particle sizes in those substances are smaller, whereas with a bar, they're whole foods sometimes, or whole ingredients, along with some processed ingredients. And one of the things that regulates stomach emptying is the average particle size of what's in your stomach. So if you're not chewing a bar particularly well, and you're just kind of woofing it down, swallowing it quickly, that may slow down stomach emptying in comparison to carbohydrate coming from gels and liquids. So that's one thing to take a look at is, you can try bars, but be careful about them and look at the individual products. And if you're going to use them, I would say make sure to chew them pretty well, especially if they contain things like nuts and seeds, like you were mentioning, that if you're not breaking those down with your teeth, are maybe more likely to cause you issues during exercise. Now, the carbohydrate concentration, what I would say about that is it's largely dependent on probably how much you're drinking. If you're planning on drinking a fairly large amount of fluid, you probably want to avoid too much of a beverage that has, anything more than 10 to 12% of carbohydrate by volume or by mass. So, most sports beverages like Gatorade and Powerade are about 6% carbohydrate. A soda or a juice would be closer to the 10 to 12% range. So if you're making your own beverage and it's 13, 14% carbohydrate and you're planning on drinking a lot of that beverage, it's maybe a good idea to include maltodextrin as one of the ingredients or as the main carbohydrate source. And that basically gets to if you're using smaller carbohydrate molecules like glucose or dextrose, it's going to increase the osmolality of that beverage. And the glucose itself may inhibit stomach emptying. So particularly if you're going to be drinking lots of a concentrated beverage, including some maltodextrin as opposed to glucose or dextrose, might be a way to slightly mitigate that reduction in gastric emptying. That being said, it may not completely resolve that issue for you. You might need to just reduce the amount of those beverages that are high in carbohydrate that you're consuming. And I guess the last one is kind of what you mentioned with the glucose-fructose mixtures. That's something I've done a little bit of research on in my own studies. And I'm sure most of your listeners are probably somewhat familiar with that concept. It's basically your gut cells have these transporters that take the sugar from the luminal space, which is just the tube that the food goes through, across the cell membrane into the intestinal cells, and then ultimately out the backside of the intestinal cells into the blood. The point is those intestinal transporters that line the gut only can handle so much carbohydrate. So it's like a freeway, right? If the freeway is overcrowded, if you don't have enough on-ramps and off-ramps, it's going to cause a traffic backup, which is the same thing that happens with the carbohydrate. And the reason why that's bad is if you have unabsorbed carbohydrate in your gut lumen, it's going to pull water out into the lumen. Those carbohydrates are going to get fermented at some point. So that means bloating, gas, diarrhea. So as a rule of thumb, if you're going to be consuming anything more than 50 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, you want to make sure to consume a mixture of glucose and fructose sources to avoid or reduce the likelihood that you're going to have gastrointestinal symptoms. Because the upper limit of transportation for those protein transporters is kind of in the 40 to 50 gram range per hour for carbohydrate. So you want to use a mixture to rely on the fact that glucose and fructose utilize different transporters.
Great summary, Patrick. I hope the listeners understand how broad it is, the range of foods and different topics we could consider here, but Patrick gave a really good general overview for it. Moving on to another trending topic in the world of carbohydrate sports drinks, and I'm referring to the use of pectin and alginate in such drinks. And there is some emerging evidence that these drinks using pectin and alginate in their formulations, and the reason for using such ingredients appears to be to try and encapsulate higher concentration of carbohydrates in hydrogels, and the brands claim that this enables a smoother transportation of the drink through the stomach to the intestine, where the water, salt, and carbohydrate are absorbed. So, Patrick, do you believe that these drink formulations are promising not only in minimizing gastrointestinal distress, but also in increasing carbohydrate oxidation during exercise, or there is still much research to be performed here?
Yeah, to, I guess, provide some context, and you kind of went through a little bit of the physiology of what's going on there, but the companies are basically saying that when you ingest these hydrogels or the alginate, that once it gets into the stomach, the hydrochloric acid there is going to act on that and turn it into what we call a hydrogel that can surround the carbohydrate molecules. And the theory here is that once those hydrogel particles get into the small intestine, what normally would happen is that the carbohydrate would activate tissue there that communicates back with the stomach and tells the stomach to stop emptying so fast. Because you don't want, generally speaking, too much carbohydrate to be dumped into the small intestine all at once. Mm-hmm. So your GI system has this feedback system to prevent that. And what the hydrogel is supposed to be doing is surrounding the carbohydrate, basically maybe lowering the osmolality to a degree or the activation of those sensory tissues, which would have the effect of facilitating more rapid gastric emptying. Then once that hydrogel gets into the small intestine, bicarbonate is released from the pancreas, and that's going to raise the pH in the small intestine, and that hydrogel will then dissolve, which would allow the carbohydrate to be absorbed. So all that theory sounds pretty good, but the studies that have tested this in active people or athletes during exercise unfortunately don't seem to be that positive. Now, they're not negative, meaning it's not like these hydrogels are causing more problems, but you don't really see much of a benefit in the way of carbohydrate oxidation or GI symptoms, or performance. So for whatever reason, the theory behind this, at least based on the 3 or 4 studies that have been published to date, don't strongly support the use of hydrogels as a way to reduce GI distress when someone's consuming a lot of carbohydrate during exercise. There was one study published just in the last couple of months, I think, in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise that did show at rest you do see maybe more rapid gastric emptying, but there's something in the chain there that's missing in terms of why that isn't resulting in better carbohydrate burning or less GI symptoms. Not exactly sure why that is. We'll have to wait to see if other studies don't end up showing a benefit, because I'm sure there's going to be more of these coming out in the next few years. But currently, my evaluation of the research is not that favorable in terms of hydrogels. They're not negative, but to justify spending additional money on them, I don't really see a strong rationale for doing that at this point.
Let's hope for more research on this one to come, and hopefully we can provide an updated view in the near future here on Fuel the Pedal. This gives a good transition to something that I was thinking about asking you while you were answering to this last one, which is something that I've asked Jamie Pugh as well, and it's regarding the huge amount of different flavors available nowadays in sports gels. And Jamie was presenting this hypothesis that perhaps these different flavors might be triggers to induce the nausea usually associated with gel ingestion. Do you agree that there may be an effect here as well?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking through in my head, how I'm going to respond to this question that you're positing here. And what Jamie told you is basically what popped into my head, is that there's so many products nowadays that have different formulations, different sources of carbohydrates, different flavorings, that it becomes really difficult to extrapolate or generalize to the average athlete what's going to happen when they consume a gel, because there's dozens and dozens of products out there that have different characteristics. So I think that's a great point that he made. And I know Jamie, we're on some research projects together looking at GI distress and issues in athletes, and that's a great point. And I would totally agree with that. It makes it pretty problematic to come up with easy, straightforward conclusions about gel use, because there are just so many products nowadays that it's impossible to test those scientifically. So the limited data we do have may not completely generalize to every single product out there.
Sure, but do you think this could be, a good opportunity perhaps for brands to create neutral flavored gels to at least mitigate this effect in sports gels?
Yeah, I'm a person who I exercise quite a bit, but I'm not someone who does a lot of prolonged stuff. So I'm not using gels regularly, but my imagination would tell me that as you get into really prolonged stuff, flavor fatigue, I know, is something that affects many athletes, and maybe a more of a neutral flavor would be better in some circumstances. So I don't have all the insight behind why companies decide to put certain flavors into their products. I mean, I'm sure there's a whole food science process behind that, a whole testing process that they go through, one would hope. But yeah, to me, it maybe makes sense that there would be more availability of that, but who knows? I'm not sure why that isn't the case.
Good. So now that we got that clear and we still have time, I would like to dive straight into the whole concept of training the gut. And a lot is said about it, and we often see infographics referring to it, but I don't think we have guidelines on when to do it, how to design a gut training protocol in case it's necessary, and we just assume that we have to somehow mimic all the foods and drinks in the amount, order, and duration of the race we're aiming at. So, Patrick, what can you tell us about training the gut? How would you recommend athletes, particularly cyclists, to perform this when preparing for a multi-stage race?
So I think the first thing to consider is that I only think training the gut probably is going to be super relevant for those athletes who are planning to push the boundaries of what they're going to do, during their in-race nutrition plan. So if you're looking at an average athlete who maybe isn't so concerned about their performance, or they're just maybe going to consume something like 30, 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour, maybe 400 or 500 milliliters of fluid per hour, it's doubtful whether they really need to probably spend a huge amount of time kind of purposely training their gut. But when you look at an athlete who is planning on consuming 90 grams of carb, maybe close to a liter of fluid per hour, then it does start to make more sense that they're going to want to habituate themselves to that practice. Now, practically speaking, what's the best way to do that? That's kind of up in the air. The studies that have been done on training the gut in athletes, what they've typically done is taken individuals and had them do maybe like a 1-hour training session, and they practice consuming that high rate of carbohydrate or fluid for that given hour. And they'll do this like 5-6 times over the course of 1 to 2 weeks. And in those situations, you do see adaptations in the gut. You see gut symptoms go down. You see fluid tolerance in terms of being able to perceptually handle larger amounts of fluid improve. I think the big unanswered question at this point is, does this lead to improvements in performance? Does training your gut to handle more fluid and fuel actually mean you perform better? And I honestly don't think we have a good answer to that. It does make sense logically to me that if you're going to try and push the boundaries of your food and fluid intake during competition, then it obviously makes sense to practice and to do that regularly. Probably, at least 3 or 4 times over a 2 to 3 week period before your event, if you can do that. But whether or not that leads to improvements in performance in comparison if you just did what you would normally do with your nutrition, we really don't know from the studies that have been done. I mean, there's only really a few that have been done at this point, and the measurements of performance have not been conclusive in terms of all of them showing a benefit to actual performance.
Patrick, just the fact of finally having some consistent feedback from you is good enough for me. I mean, we're talking about something that is just left in the air as something that should be done, but with no additional info on it. And it's good to know at least that this may not be necessary in all contexts, and only when you're aiming to consume close to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour in a long race. But again, it's something very individual, and cyclists here have an advantage when compared to other endurance sports, which is the fact that they may be more used to ingest large amounts of food due to the duration of their races. And Patrick, I couldn't possibly let you go without asking you about the low FODMAPs diet. And for those who are unaware of this word, FODMAP is an acronym for fermentable oligo-D-monosaccharides and polyols. These are short-chain carbohydrates that are poorly absorbed in the small intestine and are present in some fruits and vegetables, as you may have probably stumbled upon on social media and random lists around the internet that, allow me to be completely honest here, normally scare people and sometimes lead them to exclude foods that are on the list, independently if they have any individual intolerance to that food or not. So Patrick, I hope you understand my contextualization here, and I would perhaps ask you for an applied perspective on how the FODMAPs diet should be interpreted in this context, and in a world where people easily get scared and make overinterpretations of simplistic infographics containing particular foods when looking to prevent GI symptoms.
I think the lower FODMAP diets do have some potential for reducing GI distress in certain athletes. I think the athletes that are most likely to work in are those who already have a diet that's high in FODMAPs, and also individual athletes who maybe have IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. That's another area where there's been a lot of low FODMAP diet research and improvements in GI symptoms. But you're right, it can be a difficult diet to follow because almost every single food group has something that's high in FODMAPs. The exceptions would be like oils and meat really don't have FODMAPs because there's not really any carbohydrate in those foods. But if you look at grains, dairy, fruits, vegetables, pretty much all those categories of foods have something that is high in FODMAPs. So practically, it can be a diet that's a little bit challenging to follow, and there's some question about whether it's a good idea to follow that type of diet in the long term. So it may reduce symptoms like bloating and gas because those carbohydrates aren't getting fermented if you're not eating them, but those are also carbohydrates that the bacteria in your colon are feeding on to produce things that may be beneficial for your gastrointestinal health. So one of the better studies, I think, that's been done on this was from the group out of Monash University. I think Stephanie Gasco was the lead author on it. and they just did a 24-hour low FODMAP diet before exercise. So as opposed to eating that way all the time, they just had the athletes do it the 24 hours before the testing session, and they did see a reduction in the severity of symptoms in the condition where they were on the low FODMAP diet during exercise. So if you're going to use it, I would say maybe number one, get an assessment of, are you eating a lot of FODMAPs? Is that a potential problem? And then number two, maybe just use it in situations where you're trying to really minimize the chances of any GI distress. So before a race, before an important training session or something like that. I don't know that it's a good idea to follow that type of diet, in perpetuity. And another option would be maybe just try reducing lactose and fructose in your diet first, because those are two FODMAPs that tend to be more likely to be high in their diet and problematic for athletes. And supposedly, this is based on interviews and stuff, Tom Domulin was maybe suffering from too many FODMAPs, but from the reports that I saw, he was primarily focusing on reducing lactose and fructose in his diet as compared to all FODMAPs. I didn't interview him, so I can't say that's for sure, but those were the reports that I saw a couple months after the issue at the Giro d'Italia. That's what I had seen in some of the articles on the topic.
That's a great point right there, Patrick, because whole sources of carbohydrates, almost all of them have some form of FODMAPs, and for that reason it would be unwise to just exclude all of these foods, particularly if you haven't felt any sort of symptoms with those foods. So just to make this clear for the listeners, wouldn't you say that this is mostly suited to someone who is experiencing some sort of symptoms and doesn't know what might be causing it, and perhaps aiming to remove or at least reduce lactose and fructose food sources could be a good starting point? And only use this diet. I wouldn't call it diet, I don't know, because it may be something very acute to use on a pre-race meal. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, you can kind of think of the transit of carbohydrate through your gut. It's going to range from person to person how long that takes. But for a lot of people, they start to experience symptoms once that carbohydrate gets to the far end of the small intestine and then into the colon, because that's when those carbohydrates start to get fermented. And the byproduct of fermentation, some of that is going to be gas, which can cause bloating, abdominal discomfort, pain. So I would say certainly, the meal beforehand, the night beforehand, and perhaps even the full day beforehand, you could just be on the safe side and maybe start to taper your FODMAP intake, starting with the breakfast the day before the race. But there's going to be some individuality there. It may take less than 24 hours for things to transit the entire gut to more than 48 hours, depending on the person. So it's hard to give a straightforward recommendation about the timing, but I think one full day is, for most people, going to be effective enough.
Terrific. And we couldn't finish without mentioning some supplements that might have the potential to positively or negatively affect GI function in athletes. And in those that could worsen or cause GI distress, we could possibly talk about sodium bicarbonate. We already mentioned caffeine, and we could also talk about ketone supplements, which are a hot topic at the moment and quite popular in cycling. On the bright side of the spectrum, the supplements that could theoretically or claiming to improve GI comfort are probiotics, bovine colostrum, glutamine, and ginger. These are greatly presented in more detail in your book, which I recommend listeners to check it out because it's almost impossible, as you may understand, to cover them all on the time that we have for our interview today. So, Patrick, would you please tease us a little bit with a brief overview on the effect of each of these supplements on gastrointestinal distress?
Sure, I can try and give a little bit of a brief overview here. As you mentioned, this is covered in The Athlete's Gut, the book, I think chapter 10. And I also start off in that chapter talking about the regulation of supplementation, primarily in the United States, but it probably applies fairly well to a lot of places around the world. You always want to be a little bit cautious about the supplements that you purchase because the quality of the products oftentimes is not what is claimed to be. So especially for athletes that are getting tested for doping, you want to really pay close attention to the supplement that you're buying and whether it's been third-party tested. But you mentioned some of those ones that are more likely to cause issues. We talked a little bit about caffeine. Sodium bicarbonate is probably more for your athletes that are obviously doing things that are higher intensity, anaerobic. So, the basic message I'd give on that is you can use it, but there's some strategies you probably want to employ to minimize the likelihood of having issues during competition, which would namely be taking it 2 to 3 hours beforehand, ingesting it with some carbohydrates, and that can help minimize the issues. The ketones are one that I think is really interesting. I don't do research on that myself, so I'm going to try and not say anything too conclusively. I know 1 or 2 of the studies that have given ketones in athletes and looked at performance have not been favorable, in part because those ketone supplements caused things like nausea. I think it's likely to be dosage dependent and also ketone form dependent. So if it's in the ester form versus a free form or something like that, it's probably worth checking out the book if you want more detail on that. But I think that's one where we really definitely need more research to see how well it applies for different types of athletic endeavors, because the studies that have looked at it at this point have been pretty limited. And I know they are being used pretty heavily in certain cycling communities, especially at the professional level. So it'd be great if we can get more research on that. Now, in terms of the ones that can have a positive effect theoretically, probiotics are definitely one people will try, and those are live microorganisms that you're ingesting in either capsule, pill, or other form. I would say the evidence in athletes is mixed in terms of GI symptoms. Some studies show a benefit, some have shown nothing, and there's even been one at least that's shown a slight increase in the severity of symptoms. And because there are so many different formulations and so many dosages, I would be hesitant to give any sort of broad recommendation. To be honest, the probiotics have seemed to be better suited for reducing upper respiratory tract infections than reducing GI symptoms. So maybe that's something an athlete can take a look at, is if they're continually getting colds and sniffles and things like that, then maybe adding a probiotic can be useful. Bovine colostrum, that's basically, when a mother gives birth, for the hours and days afterwards, that mother is producing colostrum as opposed to fully developed breast milk. So that's true in humans and true in cows and bovine creatures. So you can collect that colostrum, and it has these substances in it that may have a positive impact on the integrity of the GI system. So there is some evidence that taking bovine colostrum can reduce gut leakiness, which basically means it prevents sort of a loosening of the cells in your gut and may prevent some of the translocation of toxins into your bloodstream. That said, I haven't seen any studies with bovine colostrum showing any improvements in GI symptoms during exercise. So even though there's maybe a mild improvement in gut leakiness, that may not necessarily translate to fewer symptoms. And similar to probiotics, it seems like they're a decent choice for reducing the risk of upper respiratory tract infections. So that may be a better use of bovine colostrum than actually improving gut symptoms. Ginger, I guess, would be the last one I'll mention here. It's something that I've done a couple of studies on, mostly looking at soreness related to exercise or pain. But I think most people are probably familiar with the fact that ginger has also been used as an anti-nausea remedy for many years. Studies have looked at it with pregnancy, morning sickness, motion sickness, chemotherapy. Those are all things that induce nausea. And it seems like it's moderately effective at reducing the severity of nausea. So for athletes who are anticipating that they're going to develop nausea during exercise, it's something they could possibly try as a way to reduce the likelihood of that happening. Practically speaking, it's probably not a great idea to ingest a bunch of ginger during exercise because it can irritate the stomach, cause heartburn. So maybe do it an hour or two before the exercise starts. Dosages are usually like 1 to 2 grams, and that would maybe hopefully minimize the potential for things like heartburn and indigestion while maximizing the anti-nausea potential. That's all based on theory because I'm aware there's really not much research at all looking at ginger's capacity to reduce nausea specific to exercise. In the book, I do give practical recommendations. If someone is going to try using those supplements, I kind of go through, okay, if you decide that you want to do this, here are some things to consider.
Outstanding, Patrick. So now that we are closer to the end of this episode, we could finish by having you talk a bit about the psychological effects of gastrointestinal distress. Since this is something that you've done some research on, so I'll be really curious to know more about this. And we've already mentioned things like pre-race anxiety, but what other aspects are worth considering here?
So it's covered in the last third of the book. I go through why stress and anxiety can trigger GI symptoms, and then some of the remedies or approaches or strategies that you could use to maybe reduce the likelihood of that happening, including things like deep breathing, mindfulness, meditation, that sort of thing. Yeah, I agree. It's underappreciated, at least in terms of the research. I think pretty much everybody has an anecdote or experience where they were nervous, anxious, and that triggered some sort of GI issue for them, whether it be nausea, bloating, just discomfort, urge to go, number two. I've, as you mentioned, done a couple of studies on this, and these are observational correlational studies. One of them was that same group of 150 runners that I mentioned earlier on in the podcast. So they also filled out anxiety and stress questionnaires at the end of the month, and their self-reports of anxiety and stress were, modestly correlated with the incidence and severity of GI symptoms. We actually, just speaking of Jamie Pugh, him and I and another researcher, Haley Russell, who's a person I did my PhD with at University of Minnesota, just had an article accepted in the European Journal of Sports Science that specifically looks at anxiety and race-specific increases in GI symptoms. And we showed that increases in reports of anxiety, particularly on the morning of a race, were associated with higher odds of several GI symptoms, particularly nausea, and I believe reflux and regurgitation were another one that stood out. So there's at least a few studies now supporting the anecdotes that athletes experience more issues when they're anxious. That's not groundbreaking research. I think most people would guess that, but it's at least confirming that. So the next approach here would be to design some interventions to hopefully try and test whether or not, for example, if you do deep breathing or mindfulness or something else in the pre-competition period or on a daily basis, does that reduce some of the issues that athletes have? I think it's part of the equation. I don't think it's the only reason why athletes experience problems. The correlations that we observed in my studies are pretty modest, meaning they're one piece of a bigger puzzle. But for a subset of athletes, maybe 15, 20% of athletes who have a lot of stress and anxiety in their life, then they're the ones who probably are more likely to have problems. And those would be the people maybe would be more likely to benefit from some sort of intervention.
Yeah, it's definitely something worth considering when looking beyond the nutritional causes we've been mentioning throughout this episode. Patrick, so if you had to provide listeners with some general key messages regarding the topic, considering athletes who might usually suffer from such symptoms or aiming to compete in a long race that might pose a challenge to their gut tolerance, what key points could you leave us with?
I think it's important to remember that it's probably unrealistic to expect that you're going to completely resolve any GI symptoms that you have. There's just too many potential causes, and I think what you can hope for, though, is to try and reduce the likelihood, reduce the severity, so that if you have those issues, it's more likely that you're going to be able to get on top of them. And remember that individual symptoms have different culprits or different causes. So you don't necessarily want to just take one-size-fits-all approach. You want to document which symptoms are most severe for you, and then look at the potential solutions for each of those symptoms. And as I mentioned, the book tries to do that, kind of a symptom-by-symptom approach to addressing GI issues. So yeah, if you want to check it out, it's The Athlete's Gut, The Inside Science of Digestion, Nutrition, and Stomach Distress. People can start ordering it now. It's on sale, pre-sale. Starts shipping in the United States, I think in mid-April to late April. Might be a little bit behind that in terms of the rest of the world, but you can certainly order it now, pre-order it, and it should ship sometime in the next 1 to 2 months, depending on where you live, if that's something that people are interested in.
Yes, indeed. And I would also emphasize that for us nutritionists working with cyclists or any other endurance athletes, or if you're an endurance athlete yourself, this is a great go-to manual, very light and funny to read with more detailed information around this topic. So the links are available on the show notes for this episode on fuelthepedal.com. And Patrick, if people want to get in touch with you or simply keep up with your social media activity, where can people go to?
Yeah, Twitter is probably the place where I do most of my professional sort of stuff with social media. Obviously, Twitter nowadays is a little bit a bit of a negative space with all that's going on. But if you want to follow me, what I'm up to, anything I post regarding the book or other topics, it's at sportsrd underscore PhD. So sportsrd underscore PhD. And that's a place you can keep in touch with me or shoot me a tweet or a message about the book or something else if listeners are curious about anything that we talked about. And I do want to say I appreciate the structured outline of the interview here, and the questions that you asked were very thoughtful and very organized, and I think it made for hopefully for your listeners a nice start to finish overview of a lot of the issues that they may be dealing with and some of the things they can take a look at to deal with it.
No problem, Patrick. I prepared this episode with immense pleasure, and it's a topic that I consider to be of tremendous importance that needed to be reinforced, and I'm sure the listeners would agree that you did a fantastic job in presenting this info. You, alongside with Jamie Pugh, are possibly the world authorities on this topic, and please don't stop researching on this because we need you. Patrick, and given the current situation with the coronavirus, is there something that you'd like to say to people? Any message or recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I would say pay attention to what the people who study infectious diseases say. There's some great researchers and clinicians out there who have the best set of recommendations. I'm trying to follow them as best as I can. Wash your hands, sanitize your hands, especially if you are going to a public place and either are touching stuff there yourself, or you are going with your kids or someone else. And then also, again, trying to stay away as much as you can from people. It's a hard thing to do because, we don't see people sick right now or that many people sick right now from day to day in our own lives. So we think, what's the point of doing this? If this person isn't sick, then why should I be staying away from them? It's in part because people can pass the virus, it seems, even before they're symptomatic. And unless we're really taking this as a collective approach to try and stop the spread, it seems to me like it's going to get significantly worse. And then at that point, once people start seeing that there's major issues, then maybe they'll change their behavior. But unfortunately, at that point, it may be too late to prevent a lot of the most significant damage that we're going to see here early on. So, I would say follow the recommendations of public health experts who work in infectious disease and do the best you can. It's a challenging time for sure.
It's a really good message, and it's everything we can do for the moment to stop or at least minimize the spreading of this virus. We all have an important role in this fight, so let's all do our part and stay home, people. Patrick, again, thank you so much for accepting being on Fuel the Pedal. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, I appreciate the offer to come on, Gabriel. This has been enjoyable, and I always like talking about this sort of stuff. Not just the book coming out, but just to be in tune with what others are thinking in this area and what their experiences are. So that's something that I think is worthwhile. One other thing I'll mention is if they want to specifically find information on the book, they can go to theathletesgut.com to plug just the final thing there if they want more information. But again, I really appreciate the opportunity, and I've enjoyed talking with you.
And there you go, part 2 of this great talk with Dr. Patrick Wilson, The Athlete's Gut, the inside science of digestion, nutrition, and stomach distress. I hope you found this episode to be of interest, and I hope to have you here as usual for another episode on Fuel the Pedal. Wherever you're listening to this, please do your part, stay home, stay safe. Talk to you soon.